Dance music today is a culmination of many musical movements from the last few decades. Sound system culture comes from reggae. The art of club DJing came mostly from disco. The practice of sampling can be traced back to hip-hop. But there's another thread in the lineage of dance music that's often overlooked. In this video, we're going to explore the connection between dance music and punk rock. Punk rock, born in the mid-70s in the US and the UK, was loud, messy, and obscene. But the most radical part of it was an idea. If you want to make music, you don't need a big record deal, a fancy studio, or even very much musical talent. You just need the sheer force of will to get out there and do it. This idea is summed up in a mantra that's shaped independent music ever since. Do it yourself or DIY. By the late 70s, punk was getting stale.
Good night.
Many bands grew bored of its buzzsaw guitars and one-note aggression, but remained inspired by its attitude and energy. They applied this to a broader range of sounds, ushering in a movement now known as post-punk. One of the most pivotal of those sounds was the synthesizer, an instrument that would come to define the next decade of pop music. Bernard Sumner, a member of the Manchester band Joy Division, built one himself using parts he ordered in a music magazine. He used it to play the lead melody on their biggest single, Love Will Tear Us Apart, evolving their sound from this to this. Whilst punk around the globe was mutating, a similar kind of unhinged creativity was gripping the rock scene in downtown Manhattan.
1, 2, 3, 4, brutality, fire inside the skirt on the moment from here to there.
No Wave was a fiercely experimental scene that aimed to go further than punk in its destruction of musical convention. A lot of this music was utterly ear-splitting. But some of it was very funky. Bands like Liquid Liquid and ESG delivered minimalist grooves that would later influence artists like LCD Soundsystem. At the end of the 70s, synths became more available to consumers, ushering in a new genre, synth-pop. Gary Newman, a pioneer of this sound, says he discovered synths by accident.
I went to a studio to make a punk album. In the corner of the studio there was a mini moog. Luckily it had been left on this sound, which is a huge, big, bassy thing, and the room shook.
By the early 80s, Korg and ARP had released synths that were about the same price as a guitar, effectively making them the most DIY instrument ever. They were easier to learn than live instruments, and you didn't even need a full band.
Well, the great thing about them is that they can reproduce acoustic sounds perfectly. You know, you don't have to spend like 2 years learning how to play a violin. When you get someone to bow one note of a violin into your instrument, you play it back yourself.
And then it can all be done forever out of the machine?
That's right, yeah. Putting real musicians out of jobs.
Soon you had groups like Pet Shop Boys and Depeche Mode. Band member Vince Clarke soon realised that thanks to synths, he could play all the music himself. He hired the blues singer Alison Moyet and formed Yazoo. In 1983, 3 years after the death of singer Ian Curtis, Joy Division reinvented itself as New Order. Their first completely electronic track began as a half joke.
It's a phony thing doing an encore, everyone expects it, you know, and well, let's get these machines to do a track and we'll just go on. If we do an encore, press a button and then they'll go, you know. That was the idea.
The song was Blue Monday and went on to be an enormous hit. To this day, the best-selling 12-inch of all time.
I see a ship in the harbor.
In Manchester, New Order and Factory Records financed the Hacienda, an essential club in the history of acid house and rave culture. But it was on both sides of the Atlantic that these sounds were helping shape early house and techno. Over in Detroit, the legendary radio host Electrifying Mojo mixed funk and soul records with new wave and synth pop,
now being called to water.
inspiring young listeners like Juan Atkins and Derek May.
Electrifying Mojo presided.
In Europe, a generation of techno artists grew up on synth pop, many of whom still dip into those records today. Here's Marcel Detman playing one of his favourites, Depeche Mode's Photographic. But perhaps more than anything, punk also influenced dance music on a philosophical level. Like a punk concert, the ideal dance floor is a temporary autonomous zone, one with different rules and different behaviour from the world outside, which is part of its thrill. But the most important connection is the DIY ethic. As Carl Hyde of Underworld once put it, rave was more punk than punk. 10,000 people in a warehouse, making records in your bedroom, pirate radio. You could have a career entirely outside the conventional music business. This is still true today, as production software and free resources like YouTube tutorials lower the barrier to entry even further, empowering anyone who wants to jump in and see what happens. This idea of self-empowerment, of attitude and ideas over trained skill, was born not only in disco clubs or warehouse parties, but in the brief explosion that was the original era of punk.